Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong. My guest is Dr. Greg Stewart, counselor, executive coach, and former pastor with decades of experience helping individuals and couples navigate their emotional and spiritual well-being. Dr. Stewart brings a unique perspective on the intersection of faith, emotional intelligence, and personal growth, sharing insights from his new book, iCube for Couples, Facing Our Negative Emotions to Build Intimacy in Marriage. Together, we explore how negative emotions, when properly understood and managed, can become powerful tools for building stronger, more intimate relationships. Whether you're looking to deepen your connection with a partner or seeking spiritual clarity in your personal life, this conversation offers practical wisdom for cultivating emotional resilience and spiritual fulfillment. Well, Greg, welcome to the We Have a Spiritual Problem podcast. I'm really excited to talk about your books, and you have a new book coming out that'll be out in just a couple days after this is aired, so I'm really excited for that. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you came to where you're at in life as a pastor, consultant, writer, all these different things that you do. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. And of course, I always like to say, 100% my honor to be on your podcast. So thank you for the invite. So I'll go way back, but don't worry, it'll be a quick story. So I became a Christian when I was a child in junior church, like many of us did, in Michigan. And my parents quit going to church, which meant I quit going to church. And then I did the party hardy teen years, right? And then suffered the consequences from those years and then recommitted my life to Christ when I was about 20. And then I was so on fire for the Lord that I, felt called into the ministry. And that was back in the day when a lot of us had like 160 credit hours, but no degree. So they started the adult and continuing ed programs, like one night a week for a year, and you get your degree. So the degree that they offered was in organizational leadership. So I took that, liked the material, but my entire focus was to get to seminary, to get my work in my Master of Divinity. So, but my first semester in seminary, I took philosophy of counseling, which is a general course that everybody took. And that was a defining moment for me. My eyes were wide open. Number one, how much that material could be used in ministry, but also how many issues I had, of course, right? So it was self-revelation. So I got my MDiv in 3 years and graduated in 2000. And then another defining moment happened in between my MDiv and my MA. So I mapped out a dual master's, but in between that time, in 2000, I came across the book Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman from 1995, as well as started teaching for my alma mater in all the organizational leadership courses that I took in that. So I fell in love with organizational leadership. And at the same time, I was underneath a leader, a pastor, and he loved the Lord with all of his heart. I believe that, but he just had a lot of emotional struggles, baggage wounds that I could not reconcile how much he loved the Lord, but yet had these emotional struggles. So after I got my MA in counseling in 2003, then 2005, I was a senior pastor at this point and started my PhD in counselor education and supervision from Regent University. But I did my dissertation on the relationship of emotional intelligence with job satisfaction and organizational commitment, kind of a organizational leadership degree. After that, in 2008, I had a guy in my church that was this pastor. He was the VP of HR at a large medical device company, Stryker Corporation in Kalamazoo, headquartered in Kalamazoo. Very powerful organization, loved it, but I cut my organizational development teeth, executive coaching and consulting there. So I left that church in 2010, had a great experience, and then moved to Texas in 2012. And flew around the country for 3 years, working for an assessments company where we benchmarked top performers and did Leadership 360 assessments. So I would meet with senior leadership teams across all industries, all sizes, and talk to them about strategy and developing synergy amongst each other. And then I would do executive coaching with the entire team. Absolutely loved that job, but we got bought out and 80% of us got laid off. And if you've never been laid off, try it. It's awesome. Definitely growth experience. So all that to say, that's kind of how it came out to be. I was a pastor, coach, consultant, as well as a professor and the like. But in the midst of this, which catapulted the books, was after I left the ministry, I was working at another church and I had an emotional affair. And that's where, like, after all those years, 15 years or so, the undercurrent of problems in my marriage came to surface. And I was a pastor and a marriage counselor, so it was life-changing experience. And I immediately started meeting with a Christian counselor and saying, how could this be? Not, I mean, even if my marriage was difficult, how could I have, kind of, we didn't do anything physical, that's why it's called an emotional affair. But that began a 10-year process of true internal, looking at myself inwardly. But here's the great paradox, that while I was going through divorce, I grew in the Lord more than I ever have. I was getting, and I wrote about this in my book, I was getting like visions, and I was getting, words from the Lord and the such, of just incredible insight and such from the Lord. So I grew like crazy. So after the process, I grew like crazy, and I got remarried, and my marriage now is absolutely wonderful. But that kind of culminated in my first book, and then the IQ for couples, because I do a lot of marriage counseling as well.
So we're going to dive into the book a little bit, but I want to kind of also shape it by your definition of spiritual, and you've just described a little bit about how your spiritual and kind of philosophical perspective has been shaped a bit by, your life experience and how it's kind of shaped your worldview. But what roles do you believe spirituality and, our personal beliefs play in our work and our life?
So it ties together, because as people like making the connection between the spirituality and their everyday life. I talk about in the first book that everything we do is trying to achieve an emotional goal, right? The emotional goals are good, whatever they may be. Like I talk about micro emotional goals and macro. Micro is like I want to feel full, so I eat or feel rested. But the macro emotional goals, which we all have, are quality of life as evidenced by standard of living our values, and fulfilling destiny and purpose. Okay. So we're always in search for those emotional, like earthly goals, but similar with God's goals, because he's in favor of those emotional goals too. The path we take to those emotional goals is what the issue is. The emotional goal is good. Let's say, for instance, I want to decrease stress in my life, so I do the 5 o'clock, drink, right? So alcohol. So unhealthy path, good emotional goal. Same thing with sin. So my professor said that sin is trying to meet a biblical need unbiblically, right? So same thing, biblical need, which is, the experience, the emotional goal of, but the pathway is about obedience, right? So spirituality is really about the life experience and aligning ourselves with what the scriptures say. So one of the verses I've been kind of chewing on lately is when it says that about Jesus, that as a son, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. And the things that he suffered obviously wasn't just the cross. The things that he suffered was, he was tempted in all points like we are, which all the points he was tempted at were emotional, like turn the stone to bread, right? Here are the bow before me. It was all emotional. So the spirituality is a combination of Joseph, where I would say, our walk with the Lord, but it's always tied to those emotional goals as well.
Okay. So when you hear the phrase, we have a spiritual problem, the title of this podcast,
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
The spiritual problem is it, as practically as I can say, is in our country, that in our culture especially, we have a spiritual problem because people are enmeshing the path with the goal, right? So many people in our culture have the goal of, let's say, they want to experience love and they want to have empathy for people, and they want, right? But the path they're taking, they want their path validated. Like in the trans, or in the, drag queens or LGBTQ, that's their path. They want to achieve the emotional goal of love, acceptance, empathy, identity, all beautiful goals, but we are challenging the paths to that goal. But when we challenge that path, they take it as we're also trying to block their goal. So that's why we're called haters. So the spiritual problem in our culture is that path goal process, where they're choosing, I use the term, or the four words, rational, healthy, wise, and right, to describe paths. Make sure your path aligns with rational, healthy, wise, and right. And it's gone so extreme, and that's why, we're experiencing in our culture today. It's gone so extreme that people are just like, okay, having, for maybe to disclosure, but having tampons in men's bathrooms is like a step too far. It's just so illogical now. It's not even rational. It's just crazy. So it's gone so far because we're just keep validating that whatever path you take to achieve that emotional goal of identity or to receive validation or approval, that's what I think our spiritual problem is in our facing today in a major way. We've got to separate goal from path.
Okay, so how in your book you talk a lot about negative emotions. How are negative emotions considered to be really a spiritual problem for us?
So the negative emotions. So I talk about that in our experience. Emotion is energy, right? So there's good emotional energy, which is the goals, but negative emotional energy is not bad. Matter of fact, I believe that there was stress in the Garden of Eden, right? So God said, "Work the garden." Well, when Adam and Eve walked in the garden, they go, "Oh goodness, it's at point A, it needs to get to point B." So it produced this energy for them to get it from point A to point B. So negative energy is not bad. So what I talk about is, and the experience that I had is, so it's when these negative emotions get inflated. So I use this analogy of, so imagine yourself standing on the front lawn of behind you is the house of your heart, right? And the house of your heart is where all the things of life are. But we stand on the front lawn and we look at all the things that are bugging us, that are causing negative emotions. Let's say you insult me, Jeff, which of course you never would, right? But let's say you insult me and what do? I start burning energy, processing what Jeff did or didn't do, but also I start evaluating Jeff's character and I start his integrity, right? So that emotion gets inflated. And it's not about the negative emotion because, yeah, I need to talk to Jeff because he hurt my feelings. It's about that inflation, right? So practically speaking, when we talk about this process that we have to, with the negative emotions, unlock the inner strength behind our negative emotions is when we sense that inflation, we have to walk right into it. Most people, of course, want to avoid negative emotions, but we can't. We walk right into it. So I say you got to turn around and walk into the house of your heart. And in the house, there's all these rooms, which I define as the emotions: insecurity, anxiety, fear, worry, anger, depression. And there's 3 reasons for the inflation. One is that we simply believe a lie about the situation. Jeff meant to do that, right? He wanted to hurt me, which is a lie, right? So that inflates the negative emotions. But what's more revealing and what we have to really walk into is actually in the basement of this house. So the first room in this house is insecurities. Insecurities I describe as really the one that unpacks a lot of the things we need to face. So insecurities basically is something I don't like about myself, but you point it out or say, hey, and I get defensive and I try and hide it because I'm insecure. So that's one. But then there's a door off the room of insecurity and it goes down to the basement. In the basement is the machine of identity, value, and worth. You ever hear like the phrase hey, Jeff, you're taking it personally. So when we take things personally, what does that mean? It means that when that insult or whatever comes, it's impacting my value and worth. Instead of just dealing it on the surface saying, hey, and owning it, I'm taking it personally, which impacts my value and worth, which greatly inflates. So I have an entire chapter on how to build and take over your identity and worth. But in the basement as well, Jeff, there's a cellar door of trauma. Right? It's dark, dingy. There's big T trauma and then little t. Big T is the official diagnosable threat of loss of life or limb. But most of us have gone through little t trauma, right? Mm-hmm. And those are just negative experiences that carry with us today. So when we go into experience, let's say, and my mental model goes, oh goodness, Greg, here we go again. Like now I'm having more emotional inflation. So that's the process of walking into our negative emotions. They're good overall. But when they get inflated, that's the big, bells and whistles, red flag sign that we've got to walk right into them because you are not responsible for my inflation of emotions. So if I address your issue or how you upset me, like on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like a 1 or a 2, all right? You hurt my feelings, but I give you the emotional energy back of a 6, 7, or 8. Well, that damages our relationship, and that's not your issue. That's my issue. Insecurities are my issue. My identity and worth is my issue. So you should not threaten my identity and worth. That's my issue. So it's that inflation that we have to address. And that's where we got to walk into the negative emotions.
Okay. I was going to ask is, the negative emotions that we often experience, how much of that is kind of self-inflicted? And I think you're kind of leading to that a little bit as you talk about inflation, because oftentimes people just say something, maybe they're ignorant to what they're saying, or they're having a bad day. There's a variety of reasons why people say things that can offend us. And that's why I think, in the scripture, it talks about, don't offend, but also be not offended, because people are going to say stuff that's going to bother us, and it's just let it
Yeah.
go.
And that's, I mean, obviously, and people know like that. That's right. Like the phrases like, well, hey, you're taking it personally. You just need to let it go. And the person, like, or I'll say, just put it on me. Okay. I know that, but how? Right. Okay. So how do I just let it go? Right. So that's what I try to equip. So I call myself a very active counselor where I want to equip. So in the first few chapters, there's of course the psychobabble of just like this is my approach of understanding the psychology, and I talk about mental models like a lot of books do, but it's really that goal versus path thing. So the first awareness is what's your emotional goal that's being blocked by this person. And for guys, the main emotional goal is significance or some synonym of it, like respect, what have you. And for women, the main emotional goal that's being blocked in life or relationships has to do with security, right? So what I say, you first have to label the emotional goal that's being blocked. Again, it's a good emotional goal, but it's the pathway you're trying to take, number one, that needs to be analyzed. But secondly, somebody's blocking that goal. Like that's where I came out with IQ for couples. It just kind of led right into this next book that in marriages, right? So yeah, it's we know it's our issue and that other people aren't responsible, but people don't know how to. They don't recognize like how. Okay, so how do I solidify my identity and worth? And what we don't realize is it's a very much God created process of our value and worth comes from the pursuit of our parents. So if a child feels pursued by his or her parents, right, which means unconditional love and recovery from failure, as well as coaching and training to be successful. Every human being ever on earth, no human being can avoid this process. That's why I think it's God designed. It's good and healthy, but we have healthy versus unhealthy when it comes to parents. That's why we say of a child, that child has a low self-worth because it's like, I feel like I'm an okay kid, but my parents keep, ... So that's just a process that they go through. And so what we have to do is this. I say that you have to begin with, I don't need other people to pursue or validate me. I want them to, but I don't need them to. And even that one switch. So as adults, I say every adult has to make the conscious choice to remove every other adult from that formula of identity, value, and worth, right? And a lot of people, once I say that, everybody, oh, yeah. Okay, but then, of course, how do we do that, which I won't get into. But just even that one analysis, but every human being, a value worth formula, parents, and then what gets added to it is peers. So if I feel pursued by my peers, I have a good value and worth. Like, because we're getting our value and worth from, because how do we assess ourselves? Because all of us are naturally just kind of hard on ourselves, especially as teenagers. So I need to look outward like, hey, Jeff, tell me I'm okay. Tell me I'm popular. Tell me that you like me, right? We don't say that out loud, but that's a spiritual problem. So it turns into a spiritual problem when I seek alternative paths, right? Like I did my party hardy teen years. I just sought really bad paths, of course, to achieve good emotional energy, right? And that's always what it is. A spiritual problem is choosing bad paths to achieve very good emotional goals.
So what about the situations where the pursuit might be from peers and from parents that, not that they don't have good intent, but what they're pursuing is not something that is kind of beneficial to you or to society as a whole? Does that make sense?
Like, no, as far as like who's pursuing that, the person or the
Yeah,
peers
so the feedback that we get, because we can be pursued by peers and friends and parents that they mean well, but the principles of life that they're teaching us, the spiritual anchor that they have is not the right spiritual anchor. What effect does that have on us as we develop kind of as spiritual individuals?
Absolutely. So, obviously, as we grow, we have to kind of like, during the teenage years that, it's said that teenagers have to reject our values before they accept them. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the process for everybody that, people who pursue us or we pursue, it's really about we pursuing them because we want their validation because it's easy. People that are pursuing us that we don't want to be connected with, we can easily reject that. but it's really about the people that we want to pursue and be validated by if they have values or morals that, are not appropriate. So there is this process where when I talk about like creating an identity, our identity is simply facts about ourselves, which is, just it's our, let's say our roles in life. I'm a father, I'm a Christian, I'm an author. And then there's my accomplishments, and then personal values are in there, right? So you form your identity and worth. And I talk about a triangle where the top one is God or the Lord, right? So my point is that we have to decide as we grow what makes up our identity. This is who Greg is. And we do come to a fork in the road of, is Greg this or this, right? Does Greg believe in this or this? So it starts to differentiate. So as I separate, like people can pursue me or whatever, then I start to realize, like, even like I deal a lot with people that are dating, and I talk about, these concepts of, if this is your value, you come to a fork in the road where you have to choose between, because like one of the deal breakers for a lot of us as Christians is the person that we date. I mean, biblically, it's a deal breaker. They need to be a believer. But not only that, it's that what I see from the scriptures is they need to be a fully devoted follower of Christ. So Jesus needs to be their first love. So there are obviously levels of Christianity. My point is that as we have to make the decision that as we date someone, am I going to date someone who's not a believer and who doesn't have Jesus as their first love? So regardless of who's pursuing us or who we're trying to pursue, like I like them, but they don't meet the criteria. So it's a very much of a spiritual developmental process of us choosing, because in the macro emotional goals, remember quality of life, standard of living, right? But living our values, right? Because our conscience, the spirit is like triggering us saying, hey, this is not the values that I have for you, but we're going to be at most peace and rest, fulfilled, confident if we live our values, and then also fulfill destiny, purpose, calling. And destiny, purpose, calling for all of us is fully devoted follower of Christ. And that's the spiritual development process is on a regular basis choosing at all these forks in the road, this process, a path to achieve good emotional goal, path I'm going to take to meet a biblical need, the path I'm going to take to feel, right, that I have good value and worth and who I'm going to bring into my life. It's just one decision after another. That's the Pilgrim's Progress, to use the title of a whole book that we all have to face as a journey.
And speaking of titles of books, what does the I Cube refer to?
Right.
I mean, I know,
So,
but the listeners might not know.
No, that's okay. So it's actually the I with a 3 and a superscript, because I was a math major before I recommitted my life to Christ. I was a math major, right? So I like to use that always. For 25 years, I came up with this I cubed thing that I've always wanted to write a book on I cubed. But the way it formed, obviously the Lord knew this, was after the emotional affair went much deeper and beyond that. So I cubed is simply it's information, interpretation, intensity. It's a very simple process that can be very effective. So I first liken an I cube, those 3 I's, onto the Panama Canal. Okay. So the Panama Canal, the principle is that the first lock has to be filled up before the second lock can open. Okay. So information. So a long time ago, when I was a pastor, somebody would say, hey, again, I keep using you. Hey, did you hear what Jeff said about you? I'm like, no, what do you say? Then they say, I had to talk to Jeff. So basically the principle is, it is illegal for me to have any opinion, interpretation, or any emotion, intensity, until I have all the information. Now, Jeff, brother, imagine if everybody in our society and culture just applied that one rule. It's illegal for me to have any opinion or any intensity until I have all the information, right? Or all the information I get. So once I have all the information, the second I is interpretation. So we use this, like, for instance, like our interpretation of something, like if we're upset, negative emotions is going to be negative. So it's negative, neutral, positive. So interpretation is really about critical thinking and just looking at something objectively instead of just subjectively. So basically the question is there any other way to interpret this, right? And there could be several true sentences of interpretation. Some are neutral and say, logically, this played out this way because of ... It's just neutral. And then positively, well, think about it this way, that this can actually, they might have thought this and that's why they did it. So now the way they did it, right? It's intent versus impact. Now, they didn't mean to, like they were truly trying to do their best for you, but they didn't realize the impact. So intent versus impact is always, I didn't mean to. And like our daughter used to say that all the time. I didn't mean to. I said, yeah, honey, but the dog's still dead, right? So you still have the impact of it still the same. So interpretation is stepping back objectively and looking at it the way God would look at it, the way others would look at it, that would challenge my initial interpretation of negative. And so once the combination of the information plus all of the statements that coexist together of interpretation, intensity simply is that emotional energy based upon, okay, what's the most rational, healthy, wise, and right response? Because again, emotional energy is there to burn off in response to a situation. So then it's just critically thinking through the most effective response. And normally the intensity on most things, emotional energy that's needed is like, again, a 1 or a 2. I just need to call them up and set a boundary or whatever it is. But again, that tells you like, but why am I still at a 6, 7, 8? Ding, ding, ding. It's because you got to do a deeper dive into something else. Anyway, that's IQ, information, interpretation, intensity.
Okay. And so as we've been talking, I mean, obviously you have underscored being a pastor, Christian, believer. How does this book apply to someone who's saying, hey, I'm sitting there listening to this. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a believer. I'm into this podcast because I'm exploring what it means to be spiritual. How do you bring that person into this conversation?
Yeah, great question. So if we just not use any of the biblical ease or Christianese, resonating around that everything every human does is trying to achieve an emotional goal based upon micro, macro, and that the reason why you get upset is because your emotional goal is being blocked, right? That's very human, not just Christian, right? And then we get into the aspects of, the mental model as well as I call it the emotional storms, but insecurity. I mean, good night. Like I worked with as a director of a residential treatment center after I left the consulting gig, and a lot of those girls, I mean, they weren't believers, but I would challenge them. So whether it be like on insecurity was a big one. Insecurity is really a powerful one that we need to face. So girls would say, Dr. Greg, she's pushing my buttons. I'd say, well, uninstall your buttons, right? So the issue isn't that she's pushing them. The issue is you've got buttons to push. Right. So again, it's taking the power back from our environment. That's a very human thing, not just a Christian thing. Right. Another gal said, Dr. Greg, she called me a beep, right. And I said, well, girl, the problem isn't that she called you that. The issue is you agree with her. You didn't want her to point it out. Right. So I'd say the issue is not what she thinks of you. The issue is what you think of you. Right. And I had a great relationship with them. I mean, kind of like, well, geez, Dr. Greg, no, I had a great relationship with them and I'd pour into them. I love those teenage girls. But so it's a human thing. So like identity, value, and worth. Oh my goodness, like people like carrying like in their adulthood, they're still like just hurt and carrying the bondage or whatever from their parents. Like, why don't my mom and dad just own it? Right. So when I say, look, you don't need them to own it or pursue you or validate. You want them to, but you don't need to. And when you do that, it doesn't change the definition of relationship or the expectations of relationship. What it changes is when you do need to want is the degree of impact it has on you when those expectations aren't fulfilled. That's what it's about. So you say, look, you go from devastating to disappointing. I'm not devastated by what my parents did anymore. Do the Texas, bless their hearts, right? I'm not devastated anymore. I'm disappointed because they should have been healthier parents. So it's a removal of that emotional energy where it should be. So that's very human. And it's obviously, and also trauma, negative experiences. They know that, yes, my mental model scoops up the emotions of the past and plops in a second. Remember, I would say that, I don't know if it's half and half, but I work with a large percentage of my caseload. I see about 40 clients a week, both individual and for marriage. And a lot of them aren't believers. And, I refer to these concepts and they're okay with it. Some people say, I don't want anything about God. I said, that's okay. Because all truth is God's truth. Rational, healthy, wise, and right are God's words. Right. So I have no problem not talking to them explicitly about the Lord, because if I get them to think more rationally, more wise, more right, healthy and more right, then I'm moving them towards objective, absolute truth, which is God. God owns all truth, right? So I do that a lot with non-believers. I don't have to incorporate all the, the Lord sees you as a crown on diadem, or whatever, all those words that that we use. So it's just the same terminology, because that's the way God created us. We're emotional creatures. trying to achieve the highest quality of life.
And so along that line, what roles do concepts like compassion, forgiveness, or mindfulness play in solving not only this problem, but all the problems that we might describe as being spiritual problems?
Right. So again, in the emotional human experience, and this is what I find amazing when I talk about, like, especially the couples, that, so we think of forgiveness that, even Christians do. Forgiveness is enmeshed with, like, everything's okay now, and it's not. So forgiveness is simply releasing the right or authority to judge, punish, condemn, or seek revenge. Like, I'm going to release that to literally the authorities or to God or whatever. I'm not going to be the one to seek it, right? So that's literally forgiveness. I'm going to forgive and not seek it, but like unconditional love. So unconditional love simply means that regardless of what the person did in the past or prior to this moment, I'm still open to restoring the relationship. But unconditional love does not equal unconditional trust, right? So we have to separate. So I point out, like, to everybody, look at all of the TV shows and movies. What is even the secular world screams, hey man, you got to forgive because you're becoming bitter. I mean, it is even all the way through the secular. And if they don't, and like the revenge movies, right? At the end of the movie, like, again, totally secular movie where the person catches the person that harmed them and somebody's off to the side and they have a gun in their head. It's like, Bob, don't do it. Won't make you feel any better. Right. So it's like, even the secular world knows that revenge is not the answer. Right. Now, in some movies, they're like that. But basically, after that, the person either gets arrested or they do, seek revenge and they don't feel any better. So compassion, actually, and empathy. So all those words, like pathos is the Greek word for suffering. Like even the Passion of the Christ, that movie back in 2004, Mel Gibson. Right. I ask people, what's the passion there? And they say, well, strong emotion. No, it's suffering. It's actually the suffering. So compassion is suffering with. So we're in our current language, it's empathos, empathy, and sympathos, right? It's different degrees. Empathy is I get what you're going through. I've not been through it. Sympathy is I've been through it and I feel you, right? So it's all the same. And that's, again, a human construct or human values. So there's still, like, that's why the Imago Dei, that even non-believers are created in the image of God. And it says in Romans that even the Gentiles who do not have the law are a law unto themselves, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts either accusing or else excusing themselves. That conscience is an Imago Dei, image of God thing that every human being has. That's why there's certain moralities, like C.S. Lewis points this out in Mere Christianity, regardless of where you go in the world at any time, if you walk up to somebody out of the blue and slap them across the face, every human being in the world ever would say, hey, that's wrong, right? Or you go to take a seat on a bus and somebody dives in and takes it in front of you. Everybody on earth, regardless of background, would say that's wrong. There's a foundational morality. That's the conscience. That's the image of God that every human being has, right? So that's where it's a human experience and not uniquely a Christian one. Right? So the Christian experience is, I think there's two decisions. There's a decision for salvation, which is a gift. I believe that Jesus died on the cross for me, right? Gift, salvation. But there's a second decision, and that's a decision to make the choice to follow Christ. I believe, I know there's debates on this, but I believe, because Jesus said, first sit down and count the cost. And then he uses a couple of examples. I think discipleship and making Jesus your first love and leaving all to follow him, and hot, lukewarm, or cold, the decision to stay hot is a decision that believers have to make, that they really go into this battle where Jesus said he was tempted in all points, yet without sin. And that temptation had to do with, similar to the emotional experiences of what, Jesus said, do not be discouraged. You're going to have troubles in this world, but I have overcome the world. So spirituality has overcome the world. And if you look in Revelation, it uses that phrase, he who overcomes. What is overcoming the world? Well, what's the world? 1 John 2, all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, emotion, it's not of the Father, it's of the world. He's saying you are lusting after these paths to achieve very good spiritual, emotional goals. But he who overcomes, right, and learns obedience to the things that you suffer, right, is the one who overcomes. That's actually the narrow road. the narrow road of actually choosing, I'm taking this on my flesh, discipleship. So that's truly the spiritual problem is, yes, it's sin and the penalty, so accept Jesus as the gift. But as believers and even for non-believers, it's the path, the spiritual path we take of I'm going to overcome the world by choosing obedience, of I'm going to choose the paths that God has for me to achieve very good emotional goals instead of the path I'm choosing. And if I keep choosing this irrational, unhealthy, and wise path, I got to figure out what's going on in here. Why am I so stuck on this one, right? And that's the spiritual process, choosing right paths to achieve very good, healthy spiritual and emotional goals.
And you used the word empathy, and a quote from the book I wanted to bring up in our conversation was, "Grace and empathy without truth and boundaries is enablement. Truth and boundaries without grace and empathy are toxic." Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit for the listeners and viewers?
So I don't know where I thought of this when I thought about when people, I just hear people talk, and I work with couples especially, and there's always one parent's more graceful, one parent's more like, nope, like, mother, father kind of thing. And I just had a conversation with a couple yesterday. So when I came across John 1:14, Jesus came full of grace and truth. And I just started to notice that all of the relational, I don't care if it was at church and marriages it doesn't matter. I kept saying, well, yeah, well, what you believe they should or should not have done is right. But man, the way you did it, the way you described it, the way you came across to them, I'm like, they gave only truth. They didn't give grace. So it came across as toxic, right? So I came up with this, and even with our culture. So in our culture, like the pendulum, so how do we, step way back and look over like 40 years, that people always complained back in the, 60s, 70s, 80s, that it was kind of toxic because it was just so legalistic and truth-based, like, right? And people like, man, just like, it was toxic. So they swing way over here, and that's where, every kid gets a trophy, started there to now, hey, let's put tampons in men's bathrooms. So there's so much grace and empathy, there's no truth and boundaries. So I see that now it's starting to come back. So it is, there's always two goals. There's always in any approach. And normally it's grace and empathy. You got your grace and truth. So in every conversation, you got to both bring grace and truth. So grace and empathy without the truth and boundaries is enablement. You're enabling them to continue in their unhealthy paths because you're not bringing truth, because you only have empathy and understanding. However, truth and boundaries without that grace and empathy, which is Matthew 7 type of judging, right? Do not judge lest you be judged. That's toxic. So the combination of both grace and empathy and truth and boundaries is where you get true judgment, because true judgment, there's a lot of good judgment. Like the Apostle Paul says, I've already judged you in this matter. So not all judging is bad. The judging that basically Matthew 7:1 is pharisaical is, you failed, and now I'll never see you differently, and there's no hope of restoration. That's pharisaical judging. That's the judging that Jesus talked about in Matthew 7:1. But the judging where Paul says, I've already judged you in this matter, is an unconditional love judgment. I'm judging you. Here's truth and boundaries. What you're doing is wrong. You need to repent. But unconditional love, let me show you how. Let's walk alongside each other. Let's help each other restore a ministry of reconciliation, where you get into 2 Corinthians 7, worldly sorrow versus godly, and there's a pathway to restoration. Right? So truth and boundaries is, this is the truth. You need to repent. But the grace and empathy is, hey, we're all in the same boat. Let's help each other and train, figure out what's going on and get sanctified and have a new life. So it's always that combination of grace and empathy and truth and boundaries to achieve both goals in all conversations.
And it seems like our society is really two pendulums that have kind of separated in this divisiveness. And we got to get back into both sides of that pendulum, kind of coming to the middle and having the grace, the empathy, the truth, and so on. So
right. So I think that it's kind of obvious that the complaints, like the Democrats, they've gone so far, and they'll swing back. But back in the 90s, I remember seeing a bumper sticker: Democrats serve the people. Right. So I step back and say, okay, two goals. Republicans are basically pull yourself up by your bootstraps and suck it up, buttercup. Right. There's your truth and boundaries. Democrats are like, hey, people are down and out, and they're poor. Serve the people. Give them grace. Entitlement. Again, a strength taken too far becomes an extreme. So that's what the Democrats are now, and that's where the Republicans are nailing it as far as balance, right? And the Democrats are only about grace and empathy. So But the goal always is, let's say when both parties are kind of in their wheelhouse of the Democrats are more emotional, grace and empathy, understand, be compassionate. That's why many Catholics have been Democrats for decades and decades, because the Catholic Church so much emphasizes that grace and empathy for the poor. It's like, why would Catholics, and Jews be Democrat? Because of that heartbeat of serving the poor and caring and helping out. But then you have the Republicans, which is also true of, be independent, it's your own choice and you're responsible for your own choices. So that's where a lot of other denominations are there. But it's always both. We've got to achieve both goals. And that's the great tension. That's why I love our country is good at its core, because we're in that tension always. But human, obviously, sin comes into, and then you have all that other stuff that gets involved in it. But at the core philosophy, it's grace and truth. That's where it should work.
So maybe this can bring us together a little bit better, huh?
That's the hope. Or we just wait for the millennium when Jesus rules and reigns on the earth, which you might have to.
Right. So what practices or tools, whether they be spiritual, secular, or scientific, do you believe can help individuals and communities kind of address these spiritual and existential struggles that we're kind of going through right now?
Yeah, I would say, because I've taken it's been a mission of mine. My books come out, and it really has to do with, number one is don't avoid walking into negative emotions, right? So there's a million techniques to do it. But I would just say, if to kind of remember a couple things, one is we got to walk into our negative emotions, not run away from them, right? They're showing us something very powerful. Number two would be separate emotional goal from path. That is killing us. It kills us in our parenting. It kills us in our schools. It kills us everywhere that we enmesh the goal of the path. So if a child wants to choose this path, we don't want to hurt their emotional goal, but the path has long-term consequences. The path is not rational, healthy, wise, and right. So not more of it's more like, in the book, I call it a mental model formula formation. So just like kind of a walkway. There's a million techniques that I get into, which we can't for every emotion and thing, but really it's about the mental model formulation. I would say those two: walk into negative emotions because they're revealing something. And secondly, separate that goal from path. And then I guess number three, you have to have three, 3 points in a poem. So the third one would be the grace and empathy and how we go about, in relationship and these conversations.
Right. And how can people begin to foster a sense of purpose or connection, even if they don't identify with a specific faith or belief system?
So I talk about, my next book is going to be IQ for leaders. And in that, I talk about, people, leaders and people getting a mission, purpose, destiny, calling. And again, this is a human thing. And it comes from Genesis 4, that post-fall, that everything on earth, every technological advance, every job is either trying to solve a human problem or enhance the human experience. Everything we do, right? It's a response to the fall. So even with people who aren't Christian, I'd say that the deeper thing, because we have a skill set, of course, that we, get jobs, but the purpose and calling is based in those things of, as far as destiny, because I've had countless men who are in their mid-30s. Even I've had an anesthesiologist and a radiologist. They're making over $300K a year, and they still feel this loss. One was not a believer, one was. They both felt it. And it had to do with the fact that they were doing a skill set, but they weren't hitting the heart mission, which, I believe, Chuck Swindoll years ago said, or Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way they should go. That's not a morality, because that's not guaranteed. The way actually has to do with Derek, the way God designed for them, which is purpose, destiny, and calling. But that, it's a deeper dive. So regardless of what faith you follow, there is, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. It's that. It's fulfilling purpose, destiny, calling that hits what I call the Iron Man core in our heart. And that's our mission. And that comes from life experiences, and it kind of forms into, but basically it's either trying to spend your life trying to solve a human problem or enhancing the human experience. I always point to Howard Schultz and Starbucks, right? That was his mission. He wanted to improve the human experience. Like coffee, man. I mean, you want to talk about a connecting point? Let's get together for coffee. That was his. So it had nothing to do with solving a human problem. It had to do with increasing the human experience. Because back in Genesis 4, it talks about that these descendants became shepherds and herdsmen, which I think is commodities, the foundation of our society. But then these descendants started making tools, solve human problem. But these descendants started making musical instruments, enhancing the human experience, enjoying life. That's why I say there's always two the emotional goals. So it certainly could be on the enhancing human experience. I mean, somebody had the vision of starting a cruise line, I mean, or a spa. I mean, that is 100% enhancing the human experience. So that's deeper of finding that purpose and calling, which is, again, another human thing.
And so we talked a bit about divisiveness, and we talked, Democrat, Republican, Christian, non-Christian, believer, non-believer. How can we create spaces where conversations about spirituality, beliefs, or meaning are safe and inclusive?
I would say that whenever, like, let's say on these divisive opposite sides, what I found is when you validate the emotional goal, right? So validating the emotional goal, because we're tense, like, okay, we're walking into a room and it's like, okay, we automatically disagree. But you know what? I just want to say that I want to do everything I can to achieve the emotional goal of helping our young people, be secure in their identity. Really? Yes, right? I need you to be open to that there might be other paths besides the one you're promoting. Because it was just a few years ago when I worked at the residential treatment center, there was like, for every one transgender boy on the boys unit, there were 20 transgender girls. But it's forming a new identity. Like the girls, why would it be so bad? Because the girls were trying to achieve the goal of security because they were treated poorly by a man or a boy. So by becoming a boy, they now became peers with the ones that hurt them. So they gained power and security. Secondly, they assume, this is all subconscious. They assume that by becoming a boy, Alex, that now the boy that harmed them, boys will look at them as a boy and not be tempted to harm them. So there's very much and then there was no validation. Everybody understood, even just a few years ago, that the gender dysmorphia was across the board, right? So validate anytime you are in conflict with another person, validate their goal or their emotional goal. Like, I'm on the same page as you. I want to make sure that we help them, him, her, feel secure and confident and so on and so forth. But we have to hold them accountable about the path they're taking to achieve it. So that immediately disarms, I think, by validating the emotional goals, and that, that's how we team up, because we really are disagreeing about the path to the emotional goals. That's where the arguments come in.
That's great advice. So what's one piece of wisdom or insight from your own life or work that you believe can help others address the spiritual challenges that they're going to face?
One piece of advice would be that when we experience these negative emotions, right? Because it's always about that. I see people, that they frame the Lord, as, God sitting on a throne. They have to see the Lord like as Jesus. Jesus is described as the full, all the fullness of the Trinity, of the Godhead, is in bodily form. So Jesus's perfect theology is a quote I heard from a pastor, where they have to take the negative emotions and bring them between them and the Lord and discuss them, because that's, the Lord says, like, some people say, like, I just want to, if I can just get past this then I can. And the Lord says, I want you to scoop up those things that you're struggling with, those negative emotions, and plop them right between us, because I love you. See me as your first love. See me as your fiance. See me as somebody who is much more emotional and passionate about your struggles than even you are. Meaning, I want to meet you here because this is where the miracle is. This is where the miracle is. All right? So that's in that our spiritual journey. I mean, non-believers always say that you Christians use God as a crutch. I don't care how many degrees I have, unashamedly, absolutely, I don't know how I'd get through this life without the Lord. I just don't. This world is a mess. I'm a mess. I'm broken. And where else can I go with my deep, deep eternal struggles that I'm not really comfortable sharing with anybody else? Because if I share my emotional struggles with my wife, now I got to process her processing me, right? Understandably, that's just a human thing. The Lord's the only place I can go. But we've got to not run from our negative emotions. We got to walk into them and bring the Lord on that journey with us.
So for our listeners who are struggling with their own sense of purpose or meaning? What's one small step they can take today to start addressing that?
Answer that question like everything we do like is either trying to solve a human problem or enhance human experience. So ask yourself the question, what is one thing, because normally it's on the negative side, what is the one thing I can't stand about the world, right? There's a million problems or a million issues, but there's this one or two that just drive you insane. What is it? And then keep digging deeper. Like, okay, like challenge, like big deal, right? Who cares? It's a problem. Yeah. But keep digging. And it's why is it a problem? Come up with that word because it's going to eventually get down to where you're going to agree with God, but it's in the description of how does this problem eradicate the human soul, like poverty. Yes, but it's not just the micro emotional goals of food. There is a soul level problem, the eradication of the imago Dei that poverty links to, right? Or sex trafficking or any ill in our society. That's number one. Is you keep asking until this is where God and I align. But where's that? Why is that this problem as opposed to the other ones? Look backwards. It always comes from our human experience. That's why the Lord uses our human experiences to direct us into the way we should go. Proverbs 22:6. And it's always that. So either you experienced it or you observed it, and something in that created a holy discontent. Great book by Bill Hybels, this holy discontent where I can't stand this. Yes, there's that, but I can't stand this. Listen to that voice. All right. And there's something there for you.
All right. Well, I'm finding with this podcast, it's hard for me to kind of come to a wrap. I have another podcast. It's the Aging Well podcast. My end's always, and keep aging well. Right. But I find we always kind of end this one on kind of a high spiritual note. But I want to detract from that just a little bit and have you kind of share with the listeners where they can connect with you, where they can find the books. The new book coming out here is this airs in just a couple of days. So where can they find that? Where can they connect with you?
drgregstewart.com. Right.
Pretty easy.
Everything's there. So it's Stewart is EW, not you. I just want to clarify that. So one word, Dr. drgregstewart.com. And I got my books there. I've got, all my background, everything I do, drgregstewart.com.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time today. This has been a great conversation. I think all of us now, as we listen to this, can take a 180 and just walk right into those negative emotions that we've been experiencing, whether we're Christian, non-Christian. Take this to heart that this is information that is great for all of us, and it's going to heal us all spiritually. So thank you for your time today. Any last words?
Yeah, I do want to say that. First of all, thank you, Jeff, for the opportunity. So you mentioned like leaving on a positive note. This is the positive note I want to leave with. So through my journey of, my walk and journey that through my success as well as the downfall of my emotional affair, which I talk about in the book, I can say walking into the negative emotions that coming out the other side, it's not, you don't live there, you come out the other side. I am stronger now than I've ever been. I don't have insecurities. I have more peace. I have more rest. I have more fulfillment. I have more confidence than I ever have. Walking into the negative emotions is a pathway and a journey that on the other side of it, you will be stronger than you ever been. That's what I want to leave with.
And I'll end there.